Hi, this is a Curvy 3D character modelling tutorial in the Gigantic series. In this video we'll be sculpting the arm and giving our character a basic costume. So here we have the brown version, which is what we're aiming at, and the white version is what we'll be modelling on. I'm just grouping and connecting all of the pieces together, grouping the hair under the head and so forth. Now I'm just going to hide all the parts I don't need to see and get back down to just the arm. So we're going to leave the arm as unconnected pieces, so the shoulder, the upper arm, the lower arm and the hand, they're still going to be unconnected at this stage. We can merge them later once they're posed. So for now we're just going to sculpt the unconnected pieces. And as usual we're going to change the lathe into a subdivision mesh, meaning we can sculpt into it and add detail as we go. Still just doing a little bit of housekeeping, removing the parts I don't need. There we go, we've hidden everything so we've got a nice clean view. As soon as we start sculpting, it will actually turn into an editable mesh with the first stroke we paint. But if we press J, it'll turn into a subdivision mesh, which will add detail. So as before, one of my favourite brushes, sub brush with a bit of pinch, and just cutting the shapes into the grooves between the muscles. Again, it helps to have a reference picture from the same sort of angle, so you know where you're cutting. The lower arm, I apologise, my anatomy is appalling. I tend to just paint some stripes to look like bunched up muscles coming down to the wrist. And again, if you're copying off a reference, you should come up with something fairly decent looking. If you want something which is great, you probably want to learn your anatomy some more. For instance, I couldn't name any of these muscles, but they look okay. And in the final illustration, this arm is going to be reaching out of the screen, very foreshortened, so you won't be able to see much detail in the arm anyway. So it doesn't have to be as precise as the head. If you hold the shift button with the sculpt tool, you get the smoothing tool and you can smooth out part of the surface with that. So quite often I'll switch between add, sub and smooth by using the left and right mouse buttons and using shift to do the smoothing. Next I'm going to model some of the costume. You can see on the left what we're aiming for. Now this part of the model is barely seen in the final illustration. It's obscured by trees and the forward hand and the sword, and so I just want to give an indication of what the costume is going to look like. However, the wrist guards are going to be quite prominent, so I'm going to give a bit more care to those. So here I've drawn a loft object by drawing along one side and then an arc at the bottom and an arc at the top, and then drawing along the other side. The order here is quite specific. You draw one side, bottom, top, and then the other side, keeping your strokes from bottom to top going in the same direction. If you end up with a sort of twisted, distorted shape, I recommend starting again, drawing one stroke up the side, one stroke at the bottom, one stroke at the top, and then one stroke up the other side. You can have a loft just with the first 2 strokes, but adding the second 2 lets you give a bit more definition to the shape. I've increased the depth of the loft here as well to give a bit of thickness to the shape. And doing a copy and a mirror paste, we'll chuck it onto the other side of the model. If your mirror paste isn't lining up, it's probably because your model isn't in the center of the scene. So I'm lining up with that slightly lighter grey line in the middle of the grid. And now I've lined that up, my bracers should copy and paste into the right place. We'll be detailing those a lot more later on. This is just the basic form, the basic shape of that part. Now we're going to proceed down to the bottom. Again, drawing a loft. So draw one end, draw one side, draw the other end, draw the other side. And you end up with this 4-sided shape, but they can be quite sort of curved shaped sides. We could draw the same shape with a slab object, where we draw the entire outline and then it has some thickness. But sometimes I prefer to use the loft because you can curve it a bit more forward and backwards. It doesn't have to be flat. Just using some cylinders for the details on his belt. You can make a cloth belt by using a very ziggy-zaggy curved line for a lathe, using auto lathe to give it 2 sides, increasing the resolution so we can see all the ripples clearly, and that gives us a simple cloth belt. If we sculpted into that later, you could make it look more natural. Just moving the middle curve down a bit to give a bit of shape. Again, using Shift and the Move tool to drag things in and out of the screen to line them up in depth around the belt. For these little armour pieces, I'm making a lathe, using auto lathe to make it 2-sided, dragging the other side across the other side of the leg. So we had a sort of J shape, which we dragged across. Now I'm going to convert it into a mesh and use the soft move tool with quite a pinched shape. In the panel to the left, you can change the shape by dragging on that sort of white triangle. So I changed it to a quite pointed shape, duplicated with Ctrl-D and dragged it down to make a copy. Just make some ropes with the line tool, changing their width and turning off their smooth capped ends. So it's a nice sharp end to the rope. And duplicate to make another rope. If you select more than one object by holding Shift, when you select, you can change all their properties at once. So there I changed the width of both ropes at the same time. It's always good to duplicate parts of the model you've already made. Potentially this belt buckle could be much more ornate, and then we could make copies of that going across. But again, you're not really going to see it in the final, so I'm not going to put the work into making it ornate now. With the soft move tool, you can also use Shift to drag a part in or out of the screen. Again, very useful when you're lining up shapes against each other. This one's tricky. I want it to go behind the middle buckle and in front of the smaller buckles. At this point, I want to make a copy of everything I've done on the left and chuck it over to the right. So I'm selecting all those parts, grouping them, copying and paste mirrored onto the other side and making some slight changes to the shape. The next part will be posing the final character.